Hello and welcome to the Religion and Media Centre podcast, which we've called The Big Interview. And the title is certainly justified this time because we're going to discuss the future government of the Church of England in the face of claims that it has seen a total collapse of trust and that it is run by a cabal at the top. Our interviewer is the man given the job of coming up with a reformation of the Church of England's governance. He is Sir David Lidington, the former Conservative MP, leader of the House of Commons, and Theresa May's de facto Deputy Prime Minister. He's also won University Challenge twice as captain of the Sydney Sussex College Cambridge team in 1979 and as a member of that team that won the 2002 University Challenge Champion of Champions series for the show's 40th anniversary. Wow, I'm extremely impressed. Welcome, Sir David.
Thank you, Roger. Good to be here.
You had one of the toughest jobs in the world, working with the Conservative government of Theresa May, trying to get some sort of compromise on Europe through. You'd have thought you'd had enough of difficult jobs. Why did you accept this one, which everybody thinks is a poison chalice?
Well, I was asked very nicely by the Archbishop of Canterbury to take this on, and the idea was that if I can slightly correct your intro, that I don't think I'm the man who's charged with carrying out a reformation. I don't quite see myself. I've studied Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer, but I don't quite see myself in their mould. But rather to provide an independent chair to the task force, the project board that was taking forward the report on church governance from the Bishop of Leeds, Nick Baines, that was approved by the General Synod back in early 2022, and which focused in particular, but not exclusively, on the central national institutions of the church. And I felt it was important to do this. My political and parliamentary government experience taught me that the machinery of government, getting that right, is very important indeed if you're going to actually give effect to good policy rather than to simply make highfalutin speeches or sermons and somehow hope that is sufficient. You need to get the exercise of authority and power and delivery mechanisms properly in place. So that interested me.
You are yourself an Anglican, aren't you? I think you were brought up a Congregationalist.
I had the pews or choir stalls for quite a few years now. I've never taken any particular interest in church government. I've not been involved in it myself. So I suppose I was asked in as somebody who is an Anglican, but who also has experience of governance.
What were your terms of reference? Because help us, the Bishop of Leeds, Nick Baines, produced a report which came up to a conclusion very simply that the organisation need to have a stronger central control, it seems to me. What was your job then? Was to just, was that not sufficient in any way for people to move forward and say, right, that's the proposals, let's implement it? Why did they need you to do it as well?
But that's a question you'll have to put to others who made the invitation to me. I think the need for an independent chair, or the request for an independent chair, arose from the accurate perception that almost anybody chairing such a body, if they were a bishop or if they were, say, a lay member of the General Synod or a clerical member of the General Synod, would be seen as having an axe to grind, that they would be representing a particular interest. Bringing in somebody like myself from the outside who was committed to the church, but who was didn't have a history in church government was a way of having the committee chaired by somebody who was genuinely independent-minded, didn't have skin in the game. The work my former colleague, Dame Caroline Spellman, has been doing in chairing the work on the future of dioceses, and it's provided that independent perspective that I think is often helpful to try and bring together people around the table whose starting point is holding very different positions. And I said when I spoke to Synod in York the other week that every single member of the board that I chaired has had to make compromises on one or more aspects of the final report we put together because we needed to find a way to come to a common conclusion, and that meant everybody accepting they couldn't get their own way on absolutely every part of it.
Now, it's called the National Church Governance Project. When you were undertaking it, Did you set any conditions? Did you have absolute freedom? Did you have any guarantees that your report would be published in full and that it would be implemented?
Uh, Certainly, it's always been very clear understanding that this would be published in full. There cannot, by definition, be a guarantee that it would be implemented, although the fact, because implementation, if it requires further church legislation, means you have to go back to Synod. The Synod, of course, has the right to accept, reject, amend any legislation that comes before it. But I think that the fact that the February 2022 General Synod, broadly accepted the thrust of Nick Bain's report and been, agreed to the creation of this project board to take implementation forward, was an indication that people did want to see change. We've not followed the let everything Nick Bain's asked. We've made some changes in some respects.
Yeah, but with respect, take it forward. I mean, you can keep on taking forward and taking forward and taking forward without actually making a final decision. I don't understand. Where's the end point of all this? I mean, did you take it? Have you taken it forward?
What we have produced now is a set of detailed proposals. Those were endorsed by the York General Synod with an overwhelming majority. Those will now be turned into a mixture of legislative and non-legislative reforms that will go back to the Synod, I hope, in February next year. We're also now going to be working in detail, following that Synod vote the other week, on a transition plan to deal with some of the complicated work, for example, as regards employment law, of moving from the current setup to the one that we envisage should happen. Now, what I can't do is wave a magic wand and change the culture of the Church of England in ways it does need to change. I believe our proposals will help to move the culture of the Church forward in a more trustful direction, where people do have greater confidence in each other and in the different institutions within the Church, and sadly is the case now. But that also requires a change of heart, and we say explicitly in the report that everybody will need to buy into the need for cultural change and greater trust, whether that's the archbishops or whether that's the most junior members of church house staff or whether it's members of the General Synod themselves.
Well, I want to look at the proposals in detail in a moment, but could you tell me about what you did find? Because I was very struck by some comments which were attributed to you, in which suggested that you were shocked by what you found when you talked to people about the absence of trust. I mean, it really was a shock.
Yeah, it was a shock. When I started this work, I was expecting that this was going to be at root about governance structures, about addressing the overcomplex nature of the Church's central institutions, the problems Nick Bain's report revealed, people not understanding that they had responsibility for certain things, other groups asserting responsibility when they had none, a right mess, a hodgepodge. What became clear as we continued with our work was that while those flaws were real and needed to be addressed, that underlying so much of this was a breakdown of trust at all levels between different institutions within the church family and between individuals. And I heard members of the General Synod week had started saying to me directly, I do not trust the bishops or the archbishops. I've heard voices from the Episcopal bench that were deeply sceptical about the value of scrutiny by the General Synod and who I think rather frankly defensive and over defensive in my view approach by some, not all, of the bishops towards the role of General Synod. And this came through again and again in conversation with people that so often there was a suspicion of one another's motives there. That on the one hand, people would say the Archbishop's Council is trying to centralize all power. It's going to railroad things through to the detriment of parishes and dioceses. On the other hand, people on the Archbishop's Council and other central bodies saying, look, all we're trying to do is to reach out to people who are not part of the church at the moment. We need to direct more resource towards that? Why don't people understand the motivation of what we're doing? And there's always going to be differences of opinion in the church, as in any large group of people engaged in a common endeavour. But the lack of trust and the degree of acrimony was something that really did shock me. And I was used to a lot of this in politics. I hadn't expected to find it in the same way in church.
Well, certainly after your last few years in the Conservative government. But you also referred to Machiavellian administrative structure. And as we discussed when the Original Media Centre did a conversation after, a briefing really, after Synod, what came across was a sense of irreconcilable differences, a sense of fraction, but also a belief that some of decisions that were being taken were being reversed deliberately by people in the hierarchy without reference to anybody else. It wasn't just a lack of trust, if you like, in motives, a lack of trust in the machinery at the very top to implement what Synod thought it agreed to.
Yes, I know. I think that's fair. The phrases that I included in the report, the reference to sort of Machiavellian tactics, to power plays, are, well, they're not my words. They are words said to me and other members of the project board by people whom we consulted, to whom we talked during the process. So those feelings are real. I thought it right when we came to publish the report that the depth of that mistrust needed to be stated on the record, because everybody really needed to understand that. And I think if you looked at some of the proceedings, actually the last two general synods, both the debate on LFF last autumn and then the debates on safeguarding more recently at York, you can see how the lack of trust has bedevilled efforts to bring people together to wrestle with the solutions to what are complicated and potentially divisive challenges.
And it is extraordinary, in the midst of all of these problems, then on safeguarding, the church seems to have got itself into even more of a pickle. I mean, when you dismiss, or rather when independent members feel they have to resign from the safeguarding structures, no wonder the church is in disarray. You were watching, I think you were at Synod and listening to the debate when the great struggle for some of these independent safeguarding figures to actually say what they thought and explain their position. What did you make of that as you watched?
A deep sadness was my reaction, and frustration, because it seemed to me that there was a recognition at all ranks of the church that things had gone badly wrong in the past over safeguarding, that a means needed to be found to remedy this in the future, to have genuine independence in the safeguarding process. And clearly, whatever the intentions behind the different appointments that were made, which I'm sure were good, well-intended, this had turned out badly. And it meant, the reality is that further harm has been done to the public reputation of the Church of England as a result of that failure over safeguarding, the failure now to come up speedily with a remedy to that. I hope very much that the work that is now in hand will sort this out. And this is an issue that in our project board, we very deliberately left outside the scope of what we focused on, precisely because it was in the hands of another investigatory body that was going to make recommendations. Now that's failed, but I mean we have confined ourselves in my team deliberately to just saying that which institution within the church any residual responsibilities for safeguarding that lay with the Church of England ought to reside. But we basically said, look, we accept that there's got to be a strong element of independence here, but it's others to take decisions on that.
Just briefly on that, you say a strong element. Surely now it has to be a totally independent structure, or there's so little trust that if it isn't totally independent, there'll be no belief in it.
I think it's a question of how you establish that independence, and you get into the really central questions as to under whose law. Is it church law that therefore can be amended by church processes, or do you go to Parliament? That any new institution responsible for safeguarding should be set up. Who is to appoint the people who sit on that institution? I think you certainly giving something operational independence is relatively easy, but the basic questions are who appoints the people who serve there, and under which authority, what framework of law is a new safeguarding institution or whatever one calls it established. But I say those are matters that they were not dealt with in Nick Bain's report because they were being dealt with in a separate process, and it's something that we very clearly agreed, and my group, we lay beyond our remit. But my view is, for the sake of the church's reputation, for the sake of building trust, above all, for the sake of vulnerable adults and children, this needs to be sorted out as rapidly as possible.
Now, just before again we look at your specific proposals, do you think this was an accident waiting to happen? In other words, when the church is so divided on an issue such as same-sex marriage, where there's no possibility of an agreement, it seems to me, or a widely held agreement, it's this situation that has exposed the faults in the structures? Or do you think that the structures are so faulty or were so faulty that this sort of breakdown was likely to happen anyway?
I think that the flaws in the structures were going to come out at some point, irrespective of whether there were rows about same-sex marriage or about anything else. The flaws in governance are not themselves the sole cause of the culture of mistrust that exists within the church. They have, I'm absolutely convinced, aggravated that mistrust. That mistrust then in turn makes it far more difficult for people to come to agreement on the way forward on the most controversial issues facing the church. And the governance institutions aren't up to scratch. They lack confidence of others in the church to do the job assigned to them. So my view is that if we can remedy governance and have governance more accountable, that's a key part of our proposals, then while that won't solve the problem of a lack of mistrust, it can contribute to the rebuilding of trust in an important way.
Now, you propose to reduce the national church institutions from 7 to 4, to replace the Archbishop's Council structure with a new charity, the Church of England National Services. And you're also arguing for a thinning out of committees, boards and commissions, an attempt to provide clearer lines of accountability for national teams and less duplication of work. So you will reduce the number of structures, but won't the fundamental problem remain? Where does power lie? In Parliament, it's quite clear if you can't command a majority, you're finished. You are, as a party leader, elected by the party, well, either or just by MPs or a combination of MPs or members of the party, whatever. Here you have, in the Church of England, a situation where there's no similar sort of electoral process and a great argument about where power should lie. Synod believing, or many members believing, that that should be the ultimate body. Others, certainly in the past, who've been appointed as archbishops and whatever, believe they're appointed in part by God, with a special responsibility, and used to, certainly in the past, of deciding after due consideration what the proper way forward is and then expecting everyone to implement it. Where will power lie under your proposals in the Church of England?
That is something in a sense, that doctrinal issue that you've described, Roger, is not something you can put right by a piece of legislation. Somebody who contributed to the debate in Synod said we have to think of the church as more like an organism than like a sort of corporate structure. And I think that there was an important insight there, because within the church, leadership, yes, is exercised by the bishops. You know, this is not a church where votes in synods, either diocesan or at national level, are sovereign in the way you can argue a majority in Parliament is sovereign as regards to the nation's affairs. The bishops do have, under Church of England doctrine, a specific leadership role, but leadership is also exercised by people within the synod. And if the bishops have sense, they will want policies that they advocate to get the endorsement of synod, and will make adjustment to policies in order to get synod to endorse them. So I think that the leaders of synod and the bishops do have to engage in a a very serious dialogue in parallel with reforms to the machinery of church governance. The way that my group envisages this is that SENS, at the time being what we're calling Church of England National Services, this new charity, would be responsible for drawing up the plan as to how, in practice, to implement a policy objective or ambition that has been decided by the bishops and by the General Synod. If you've got the bishops and the General Synod at odds, then I think the trustees of SENS are going to find it more difficult to come to craft a plan than if they are at least in broad measure of agreement on these things. So some of this again is cultural. It's not something that can be done just by machinery of government reforms. What I think what we're setting out to achieve through the machinery of government proposals that we envisage is a clear set of responsibilities for each of the remaining church institutions and greater accountability to the General Synod, both by using the existing mechanisms much better than they're being used at the moment, and by creating a new scrutiny committee system, which in my personal view ought to operate outside synod meetings. It would be, I suppose, akin to a House of Lords or House of Commons select committee, looking at what the trustees of SENS in particular, but perhaps the other church charities as well, are doing, looking at their accounts, looking at their annual reports, probing whether a particular program of action had actually delivered the results that it was intended to deliver a year or 2 years or 5 years down the line, and doing that all in public. And that, I think, will make for both greater clarity, greater accountability, and therefore for greater trust at the end of the day.
But what it won't do is resolve arguments where there are deeply held beliefs in opposition. It can't resolve, and it presumably won't help resolve, the issue of same-sex marriage.
It can't resolve a theological difference, which at root is what the argument about same-sex marriage amounts to. What it can do is to ensure that if and when there is an agreed position on that subject, that the arrangements to give effect to that policy are carried out in a way that is both transparent and effective, and which and where people are held to account for what they have been doing with the responsibilities entrusted to them.
Now, if we assume, and you obviously hope, that within a relatively short time your proposals will be implemented, in the end it beggars the question of who implements them. Because when trust has been lost to the extent it has, in usual situations you will need fresh people to come in and implement such a system. The present Archbishop of Canterbury has been in position for a long time. Do you think it would require and need a new Archbishop to help implement this structure?
It's a perfectly reasonable question, Roger, which I'm not going to get drawn into. The Archbishop of Canterbury, will decide, in due course, how long he wants to continue in office, and that's not a matter I'm going to interfere in. The proposals that we're bringing forward, I think, could be implemented under the current Archbishop, could be implemented under his successor. I mean, my view on the pace of change is very straightforward. I believe that once the decision is taken, and I'm hoping this will come to the crunch with the legislation itself in February next year, then we need to get on with it as soon as possible. I've been involved as a member of Parliament and as a minister in looking at reorganisations of all kinds in the state. The NHS, local government, school mergers, government departments and the like. Any dislocation of that kind is always deeply unsettling, and it's demoralising for staff. There's a risk that people, in effect, spend 2 to 3 years looking inwards, worrying about whether they'll have a place in the new setup, then getting used to whatever place they do have in the new setup. Some you're not careful, if you delay too long, some of your best, most talented staff don't want the uncertainty. They look elsewhere and go get a job somewhere else when you really don't want to lose them. So I think we owe it as a church to the staff, once a decision is made, to get on and implement it as rapidly as possible. And I'd be hoping that this could be done. I say rapidly. I'm looking at 2025 to 2026 for this. Once you go through all the legislative processes and sign off by the ecclesiastical committee and in Parliament and so on, and a general election next year could grow some of those dates a bit, because committees of Parliament are all dissolved when you come to an election, and there's no guarantee in the new Parliament the ecclesiastical committee will be top of the list to be reconstituted. So there's an element of uncertainty, but I just say it really is in the interest of the church, I think, once decisions are taken, is to get on with the change and implement it. And if people get cold feet and decide to actually, for all its faults, we'll stick with the status quo, then at least do that. What I don't think one can do is just keep on debating possible governance reforms forever and a day. You need to get on and deal with this. Now, same reason as I've been very clear that my group was going to have a defined remit of things we would propose changes for. There may well be other things that need looking at. I think elements of synodical governance probably do. Members of Synod have made that case to us strongly. There's a case for looking at some of the diocesan structures and responsibilities. But one of the mistakes or problems that came out of the Turnbull report all those years ago was that it tried to do everything, and it just died a death by 1,000 amendments when it came to Synod. And the risk always is if you hold out and wait, if you think you've got every possible reform in place, it's fully comprehensive, it's just too late. There's uncertainty everywhere, and opposition has formed to one or other aspect of almost every proposal that is made. So I think you define your package, get on and do with this, and then by all means, the church needs to continue to review its processes and look at some of the other elements that might need reform as well, and learn from experience as we go on.
It sounds like House of Lords reform, which we still haven't gotten. Who knows? We might get to the next.
I have very clear views on House of Lords reform, and it's been the fate of the House of Commons to take a decision. That's the problem there.
The final thing I want to say to you is this is all terribly important, but of course, it obscures the fact that this is a little bit of navel-gazing, isn't it? In the end, the church was not set up for this continual argument. It had a specific role in bringing Christ to the people. Or you look at the issues which are faced around the world, climate change, poverty, a whole raft of things. The church really ought to deal with this quickly and then concentrate on what its central purpose is, shouldn't it?
Absolutely. And that applies to governance changes, because the church needs to be more effective. And it applies to the governance changes and the cultural change that is needed to restore trust, because the mistrust and the openly, at times sort of pretty vicious public or semi-public rows within the church, where people are impugning one another's motives, it does huge harm to the reputation of the church, and it diminishes. I mean, the words I put into the preface to the document was it diminishes the church's prophetic voice. And there are these vast global issues. I mean, I just, as an ordinary churchgoer, do find it sometimes just weird that a general synod, the bench of bishops, can spend ages and ages talking about various aspects of sexuality. And yes, those are important in terms of personal morality, but where is the challenge of conflict worldwide, of peace building, of the need for help to the poorest in the world, the existential challenge of climate change? Those things the church should be involved with and speaking on as well. And also these rows and this mistrust and incessant arguments about synod or archbishop's council and so on get in the way of, obscure the very good work that the church, local and national, does week by week in helping people who are homeless, in helping people who are mentally ill, in trying to support prisoners after they've been released from jail, in trying to support people overcome drug and alcohol misuse. There are so many local and national ventures where the church is fulfilling its prophetic role. I know we're all human beings, so inevitably that is imperfectly. And all of that is hidden because the limited airtime is eaten up by the rows about governance and about lack of trust. Those have to stop. We have to find a way of working together.
Well, Sir David, I hope that we don't have to interview you in a year's time about why no progress has been made on these measures. Thank you very much indeed for talking to us. Sir David Lidington and, of course, the Religion Media Centre will keep following the progress of Sir David's report, and our daily newsletter will be the place to find it. Just put that into your search engine. Thank you very much for listening.